Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. I will try to speak in my strange Russian Hebrew English. And I will start with a little story, and a quote, and I'll explain later where this quote is from. The author of the story is Abovyan. The story is not mine, but my husband's, but it impressed me. My husband had arrived to Israel in the late 80s. He was about 6. He went to school. His parents came with 4 children, and they were definitely inclined to wear all the clothes they had brought with themselves. So about 40 years later, in the school where he studied, I'm using it from Russian, my husband had met a woman who appeared to be his schoolmate from 40 years ago in the first grade. He didn't recognize her and he didn't remember her, but she remembered him. And he was surprised to hear, of course, you were the only child in the whole school in a shirt with buttons. She remembered it for 40 years, together with my husband. Everybody was wearing t-shirts, but the Soviet child was wearing a shirt with buttons. Another quote sounds like this. I'm quoting Yevgeny Ozerov. Even now, 34 years after my immigration, I prefer to dress like I did in 1988 in the Soviet Union. In Israel, I will always be the Russian, whatever I wear. So when I come to Russia, I look like a guest from the past, and I like it. My family, I will have no pictures because you will soon see that there are no pictures that can illustrate my subject more or less. The closest I talk about has disappeared. But I will try to explain what I mean every time I mention some clothes. My own family has immigrated from the Soviet Ukraine to Israel in 1989. And we brought a lot of clothes. And I wore everything. I wore everything feeling terribly overdressed and liking it. I was 14. My mother was telling me, nobody wears that, nobody dresses like that here. And I was asking, but does it look good? And she would say, and she would sigh and say, yes, it does look good, and I would go up. We left for imaginary worlds and dressed in an imaginary way. My parents never left the Soviet Union. They've never been abroad. And years later, my mother confessed that her first thought about Israeli manner of dress was associated with something that resembled the world of Lawrence of Arabia more than anything, and she never watched the Lawrence of Arabia. And she was relatively right, because the representatives of Bedouin culture actually wore this kind of dress, and some of them keep wearing this kind of dress in Israel. But this is not the world, this is not the culture we came to belong to. And this is not the culture that surrounded us. We came to Beersheba, and we were very close to the Bedouin culture. We met the representatives of this culture. But this was not a part of our specific world. So we really didn't know what to expect. And it was an important part of our immigration on every level, and on the vestimentary level too. I'm speaking in front of you today, but I'm planning to write a large article on a very narrow subject of the clothes of immigrants that left the Soviet Union in 1989-1991. And it will be much more detailed than my today's speech. But even this article, I'm afraid, will be only a thin slice of the giant subject that requires not only analytically narrative approach that I chose, but a comparative approach, at least on 3 levels. One is the level of migration from other countries that found themselves in similar and not so similar situations, including the situations of forced immigration and refugee situations. The level of previous and past immigrations, including the immigration of now from Russia and USSR, and the third level of mass internal migrations and especially forced migrations. So, in other words, I will be happy if my colleagues, you and especially young colleagues, will share my enthusiasm to the migratory situations of those who were, for some reason, leaving their homes and starting their new lives in, by definition, difficult and sometimes tragic circumstances. What is so special about the years I have chosen? You probably all know that I will not dedicate much time to it, but I'll spare a couple of words. In 1988, it became easier to leave the Soviet Union, and by 1989, many people got their chance to actually physically leave. But by 1999, in only 3 years, the Soviet Union had died. So this is why this very short, very narrow time period. How did I pick the voices for my research? I've used my Facebook and I posted 10 questions. The questions were the following. Please tell me which year did you live, if you left in these years, in these 3 years, these years. Please tell me which year did you live. Please tell me how did you make the decision which closest to take to the immigration for you personally. If you were picking the closest not only for you but also for others, how did you make the decision what to choose? What were the limitations that influenced you? If you took some closest that you remember specifically, what were these clauses? If you do remember some clauses that you decided to leave, what were these clauses? Were there any things that you decided to take only because of the sentimental value? Were there any clauses that you were wearing constantly after the immigration? Were there any clauses that you weren't wearing at all? Do you keep any of those clauses and do you wear them? In addition to that, I've started a series of in-depth interviews. I didn't have time to do much. I did 7 by now. I'm planning to raise this number to 20. And the most important thing is the enthusiasm with which people replied to me. I have more than 270 replies on Facebook. People went into very many details. I'm full of appreciation, and people were very eager to give me the in-depth interviews. And every time I mention this subject, I receive an amazing response. People want to talk about this time of their lives, even though it was very painful for many, and people want to share their memories about their clothes and about their work. Now, there were limitations to what people could take with them, but there were also limitations to what people could buy on the other side. People remember, the memory is a bad servant. Some mentioned $100, some mentioned $127, $174 per person that they could use to take outside the Soviet Union, which meant that they had to buy as many clothes as they could transport to the new life in the Soviet Union. Where did they get the money for it? Savings, lending, selling everything they could, selling the apartments. I have an amazing response. We sold the apartment it was a black market for apartments. We sold the apartments for the enormous sum of 20,000 rubles. And we bought clothes for 20,000 rubles. It's enormous. It's an enormous sum, but it was a decision to invest in clothes because it's something you can transport and you can use. Another idea was to buy something that was, as they imagined, required on another side and sell it there and buy the new clothes over there. It was a smart idea. It almost always didn't work because the guess of what people would buy, in Soviet Union and sell in America, in Vienna, in Berlin, in Israel, almost never worked. But the idea was an interesting one. Now, what were people buying with this money? Everything Western, everything fashionable. The largest investment the families made in clothes was for young women. It was very archaic decision, and it was very understandable. I will not dive now into the gender studies, but it was very easy to understand. People discussed with me the attempts to guess the experimental situations in which they could find themselves on the other side. And it was impossible, as they found out. They could guess that they will go to work, they could guess that they will go to school, but they couldn't guess that they will go to bank. They couldn't guess that they would spend a lot of time in institutions of any kind. They couldn't guess, I suppose, that they will spend a lot of time in Milan jobs. They wouldn't trade for them at all. They were offended. So one of my respondents said, I could imagine myself here and here, meaning at work or at studies, but I couldn't imagine myself moving from one situation to another, for example, because I couldn't imagine the transportation system. I didn't know how it looks. And a very interesting moment was that almost all of my responders remember the time, the very last months, sometimes the very last weeks before they left, as a time of, as one of my responders said, the fashionable chic. Because they've already bought those amazing Western clothes with enormous money, and they still were in the Soviet Union. And those months or weeks were the most, some of them say that this was the most fashionable period in their life. Now, one of my responders, I'll quote, said, we were buying clothes as we saw them very good and very fashionable, especially for me, the 17 years old young woman. Where were we buying it? Of course, at the black market. This way, for 1 month, I've turned into a rich, fashionable girl, and I was excited. There are so many, she's witnessing so many things in these few sentences. Now, we should remember all the time that at this period, the very late 80s, the meaning of clothes to one's social identity was enormous. It requires another article, and I tried to write this article. I have this article. It's called the. Oh my God! How do you say it, Historian?
The upper shelves.
The upper shelves of memory.
Top shelves.
The top shelves of the memory. Where I tried to explain what, in my opinion, was happening to the Western languages of the late Soviet Union. But my idea is that clothes were, at that moment, the most important marker of one's social strata, of one's social status. And it was one's way to demonstrate what what place one was taken in the new hierarchies was created at that very moment in the new Russian society, in the new society where the old testamentary language was not working anymore, and the new language was creating itself from day to day. Every second it was changing, and the closest were the easiest, the fastest way to start speaking this language. People that were leaving the country after they purchased their new clothes or many were creating these clothes by hand or turning to tailors and tailoresses of the vast Soviet Union. For a moment, they felt that they have mastered this language for a month, for 2 months. And then, after they have arrived to their new places, they have discovered how inadequate this word was. It was a tremendous trauma. It was a financial trauma, personal trauma, social trauma. It was a very strong feeling. Now, one quote. When I came to Israel, the first thing that we discovered was that young people weren't dressing like we were dressing. And my very, I will say here, decent look of a fashionable student from Odessa's Institute was rather inviting I'll try to translate it, the sexual abuse. By the way, in Israel of the 90s, everything was inviting the sexual abuse. But my look, but me in the short leather shirt and a short denim skirt, in the shiny leggings and shiny sweater and leopard skin square, I was invited with the most. So, what had created this discrepancy between the world of the vestimentary reality of immigrants from the USSR, what we're getting ready for, and the ones that have actually encountered, but they have finally pushed themselves through the iron-looking glass? I have 4 reasons for that. My guess, which might be wrong, is based on 4 reasons. The first reason is relatively easy to catch. As it was said, the imaginary land turned out to be imaginary. People didn't dress in the everyday life in Israel like they dressed on the Dynasty soap opera, especially not the young people, but neither did their parents. Female doctors didn't wear tight skin miniskirts under the white coats like they did in Vogue photo shoots. The Western fashion, as we saw as the Soviet behemoth took its last breath, was probably as cinegenic as it was exaggerated, and it was as exaggerated as the shoulder pads of our lyrics-rich sweaters made in Turkey and purchased at the famous Odessa Starokonka black market. The second reason for the Soviet immigrants' wardrobe mismatch with the new reality is, in my opinion, less obvious. I would propose to entertain a thought that in the countries where many of us have landed, the social role of the clothes in general differed from the ones that they played in the Soviet Union. I would dare to say that in the period we consider, and probably not only then, USSR was a place where the specific gravity of one's wardrobe in the construction of that one's social identity was extremely high. Since the society of the so-called universal equality, the symbolic language of inequality and the status was in reality tremendously nuanced. We were pretending, the Soviet Union was pretending that it's a society of equality. but the language of small inequalities was extremely nuanced. It was not the language of brands and prices, but the language of numerous imperceptible variables, and our outfits played an enormous role in this equation. Clothes spoke very loudly to these inequalities. Now, to the third reason. We need to add to the forementioned equation the very important fact that the Soviet so-called progressive society was in many ways a very archaic one compared to the new ones where the immigrants found themselves. The more archaic the society, the more obvious are the ways in which the symbols of the status are literally borne on your shoulders and painted on your face. While most of the teenagers in Oklahoma felt no need to have their school clothes handmade and tailored for them in order to look decent, прилично. This word in the late Soviet vocabulary probably deserves its own research. I do think that we need an article on what прилично meant. Their peers from Vladivostok often did. Even the obvious Soviet deficit, the inability to buy clothes you wanted and needed to wear to feel прилично, and quite the opposite, to feel неприлично if you wanted to. It was difficult to buy those clothes as well. Perestroika and the amount of, it couldn't explain the tremendous symbolic meaning of the fashionable clothes after perestroika and the amount of efforts and resources, when available, often put into one's wardrobe. And finally, I would like to mention the reason, number 4, that is probably the most important, most difficult to reflect upon for many of my responders, and thus most easy to keep in the blind spot, as far as I understand. It has almost nothing to do with purchasing, transporting, and even wearing the clothes, and it has everything to do with the social statuses and social strata. Let's imagine a picture. A father, a surgeon, and a mother, a postdoc researcher, with a single kid living in Chicago. What would their life be like? What would they wear at work and in their leisure time? What would be their teenage child's vestimentary strategy? Whatever you imagine tells you right now that was definitely not, I'll tell you right now, that was definitely not the situation for the typical surgeon, researcher, immigrant family from the USSR in Chicago in 1989-1991. Due to the specifics of political situation, the majority of the Soviet immigrants at that moment were Jewish families. But it didn't mean that they mostly felt like people who deserved to be dressed decently, прилично, without feeling overdressed at any given moment. Moreover, according to my responders, when they finally got the money they needed to upgrade their wardrobe before the immigration, they often felt like they could, at last, dress as they deserved according to the social and intellectual status. But after the immigration, the shift down the tunnel of the social strata was, to tell the truth, tremendous. It often meant menial jobs or some long periods of unemployment, and it definitely meant absolute exclusion from the life of the social strata where this immigrant should have belonged professionally as well as intellectually, and where people often paid quite an attention to their wardrobe. To make it simple, the surgeon and researcher from the Soviet Union didn't get to be in the same circles with the surgeons and researchers from Chicago when they arrived to Chicago. They became locked down in the so-called Russian ghettos of Chicago, and they worked in the cleaning jobs, and they didn't see the people who dressed probably very, very well, like they should. Probably their clothes were much more adequate than they thought in a different strata. So, long story short, the third problem could have been not the difference between two fashions in two worlds, it could have been painfully between two social stratas. As you can see, the subject entrails me. But I must put myself together and get to my closing points. One of the subjects I try to write about from time to time as a comic strategist that people engage in when they discover that their clothes, their outfits are inappropriate in this way or another to the moment in which they find themselves and to the whole estimatory situation. So what did the new immigrants do when they came from the dying USSR to the new world and find out that their приличные clothes are actually absolutely improper, they're неприличные, are inadequate, неадекватные. There was, according to my responders, there was a full scale from total acceptance, as one of my responders said, I liked the local fashion and I was open for experimentation. To the total denial, that's what I did. I said, no, my wardrobe is my wardrobe and I will feel like a crazy woman, but I will dress in my 14s like I dressed in that very fashionable months in Dnipropetrovsk. But I will do it. And then was the whole scale of strategies. And this is tremendous, and I will use this for the article. But in general, somehow most of us adapted to the new styles. I'm still an overdresser in most cases, but I have learned to do it in those years, in that specific year when we have immigrated. And I think that everybody who lived through the immigration in those years still somehow works on the same strategies we learned that time, we learned at that period. We are not free from that. Thank you so much.